I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. The House Judiciary Committee held a markup Thursday on gun control legislation. During the emergency meeting, Republican Congressman Dan Bishop and Matt Gaetz slammed red flag laws. The Florida lawmaker decried the measures as having a, quote, high likelihood of depriving rights. This debate comes as a string of horrific mass shootings have gripped the nation. Listen in for more from the emergency markup.
Seek recognition.
I'll speak on the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
You know, it's interesting. I learned a good bit in the scramble to get ready for this hearing, last minute called in the middle of recess, as we've discussed. But Mr. Tiffany had an amendment earlier today. I don't know if most Americans realize this, but in the existing law, it is unlawful for any person who has been adjudicated as a mental defective or who has been committed to a mental institution to possess a weapon, to receive a weapon in interstate commerce, the way it's specifically phrased. And as has been said, and I think is not generally understood, these Baker laws that exist, and I think that's the general term for them, Mr. Massey, they exist in state after state. It's not surprisingly, if you go look at the history of gun control, this has been a subject that's been debated for many, many years, and those things that are evidently appropriate have long since been dealt with. The difference between those laws that have been considered and undertaken over the course of years in the United States before and red flag laws is the words "who has been adjudicated." That is the nature of the process. These are fundamental constitutional rights that we're talking about, and we, of course, seem to have some difference of opinion about that. Some don't know that Heller recognized a fundamental constitutional right applicable to individuals under the Second Amendment. But you really cannot justify stripping someone of a fundamental constitutional right without giving them due process. Due process has a meaning of its own. The amount of process that is due has always been commensurate with the nature of the right. If we're talking about stripping someone of a fundamental right, you cannot make a very good case for skipping some limited amount of process. The adjudication of a judge on partial, an affidavit or two, particularly by a witness who may be loaded with bias for the reasons Mr. Gaetz articulated, and their rights are gone. And then the way these things the one that was stuck in the NDAA this year, and I believe the one we have that I'm hearing talked about is similar. It's the kind of thing that can renew itself. It can go up to like 180 days and can renew indefinitely. It's a permanent deprivation, masquerading as a temporary one, which should not be done in any event. So it is. I will say I'm waiting to see what the arguments are of those who advocate for this, but I think it is almost impossible to justify. And our law to this date recognizes it. That's why that appears in our existing statute as it does. That people are entitled to due process. I yield to the gentleman from Florida.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. It's also interesting to note that in many cases, the red flag law process itself would not be the most effective means of dealing with someone who is truly intent on committing one of these terrible atrocities that we all want to stop. I mean, keep in mind, in the Parkland case, you had a neighbor witness the shooter practicing in their backyard. And the neighbor was a responsible American who called the FBI and told them. So you had probable cause in that case to actually engage in legitimate law enforcement activity to stop violence, and it didn't happen. And so instead of fixing that, which totally ought to be the priority of the committee, we're instead trying to go into this kind of tit for tat, where someone with a motive against you, someone that maybe fired you from a job, maybe someone you had a unsuccessful relationship with in business or in your personal life, that would be the basis for some sort of red flag action. And so I think that you're looking at something here that has high likelihood of depriving rights, very, very low likelihood of actually being the effective mechanism to stop any type of violence.
And another thought before my time expires, one thing that really, the longer I'm here, worries me more and more is the capricious use of power by government officials. And if you don't have a sense of that, you haven't been paying attention to the American people. There's a lot more that could be said about that. Perhaps somebody else will speak to it. I will if they don't. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Georgia seek recognition?
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to strike the last word